Welcome and bienvenue. I am Barrington Walker, Vice Provost for Equity and Inclusion and a Professor of History at McMaster University and Vice Chair of the Board of Directors of the Federation for the Humanities and Social Sciences. On behalf of the Federation and McGill University, I'm delighted to welcome you to the third Big Thinking event at the 93rd Congress of the Humanities and Social Sciences, Sustaining Nature. Today, Ingrid Waldron, Sébastien Jodoin, and Angele Alook will draw on their work in environmental justice and climate action research to discuss the intersection of environmental racism, disability rights, and climate change inequities across Indigenous, Black, and racialized communities, as well as those living with disabilities and mental illness. They will be joined in discussion by moderator Angele Bernstein. Today's event will take place in English and French, as well as American Sign Language and Quebecois Sign Language, or LSQ. We will be providing simultaneous interpretation and closed captioning in English and French. Interpreters will appear on the screen, on stage, and on the Zoom screen for those of you joining virtually. For those joining us in person, to access simultaneous interpretation, scan the QR code that was posted on the doors when you entered the room. For those joining us virtually, you can click on the closed captioning button to enable captions. To use simultaneous interpretation, click on the interpretation button and select the language you would like to listen to. If you are joining us virtually, we recognize that the following land acknowledgement might not be for the territory that you are currently on. We ask that if this is the case, you take the responsibility to acknowledge the traditional territory you are on and the current treaty holders. We begin by acknowledging that McGill University, where we are gathered today, is on land which long served as a site of meeting and exchange amongst Indigenous peoples, including the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe peoples. We recognize and thank the diverse Indigenous peoples whose presence marks the territory on which we now gather. So it's my pleasure now to introduce the Big Thinking series. The Big Thinking series at Congress brings together scholars and public figures to address some of the most pressing questions of our time. For Congress 2024, the series amplifies the theme of sustaining shared futures with conversations that reflect on what remains collectively attainable and what must be done to bring forth solutions for today and sustain systems of tomorrow. On behalf of the Federation and McGill University, I thank the series' leading sponsors, the Canada Foundation for Innovation and Universities Canada, and presenting partner, the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council. Thank you all so much for joining us today. Please join me in welcoming Sylvie Lamoureux, Vice President, Research at the Social Sciences and Humanities Council, who will introduce today's conversation.
Merci beaucoup, Barrington. Thank you and good afternoon, everyone. Bonjour à toutes et à tous. Je suis bien heureuse d'être parmi vous aujourd'hui. I'll begin in English. My name is Sylvie Lamoureux, and as Barrington mentioned, I'm the Vice President Research at the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council, better known as SHRC or CRECH. And it is my great honor to introduce today's Big Thinking panel session. Let me begin with a fact that we all know. The global climate crisis requires immediate action. Sustaining nature is the imperative of our time. As humans, we have not only the ability, but also the imperative to positively shape our interactions with each other and the natural world. We have the responsibility to take on this immense challenge with urgency, insight, purpose, and moral clarity. In this regard, I'm so proud to highlight Canada's leadership on an international joint initiative for research in climate change adaptation and mitigation, for which the Government of Canada recently announced $60 million to support 32 interdisciplinary research projects supported through the New Frontiers and Research Fund, a tri-agency program that's administered by SHRC. These projects involve 424 researchers from 45 countries focused on designing and implementing adaptation and mitigation strategies for vulnerable groups around the world. I will now switch to French. Les réponses au changement climatique doivent prendre en compte les impacts sur les différentes communautés et tirer parti de nos forces diverses et collectives. Nous ne pourrons y parvenir que si nous comprenons le point de croisement entre le racisme environnemental, les droits des personnes en situation de handicap et les inégalités liées au changement climatique chez les populations autochtones, noires et autres groupes racisés et marginalisés. I'll switch back to English. It's my pleasure to introduce our thought-provoking panel who will help us envision alternative sustainable futures rooted in environmental justice, disability-inclusive approaches, and Indigenous climate leadership. Let me welcome Angele Alook, who is an assistant professor in the School of Gender, Sexuality, and Women's Studies at York University. She is a proud member of Big Stone Cree Nation in Treaty 8 territory, where she has carried out research projects on topics such as family and work, resource extraction, and Indigenous identity. Her most recent research focuses on a just transition away from fossil fuels, Indigenous caring economies, and Indigenous climate justice. She is co-author of the national best-selling book, The End of This World, Climate Justice in So-Called Canada. Switching to French. Notre deuxième panéliste, Sébastien Jodoin, est directeur du Disability Inclusive Climate Action Research Program. Ce programme rassemble des universitaires et des militantes et militants du monde entier pour générer, coproduire, partager et traduire des connaissances sur la manière dont les efforts de lutte contre la crise climatique peuvent être conçus et mis en œuvre dans le respect, la protection et la réalisation des droits des personnes en situation de handicap. Le travail important réalisé dans le cadre du programme est souvent cité par les Nations unies et les médias du monde entier. Bienvenue, Sébastien. Again to English. I'd also like to welcome Ingrid Waldron, Professor and Hope Chair in Peace and Health in the Global Peace and Social Justice Program at McMaster University. Her research focuses on environmental and climate justice in Black, Indigenous, and other racialized communities, and the health impacts. Ingrid is the author of the book and co-producer, along with the renowned actor and activist Elliot Page, of the 2019 Netflix documentary, There's Something in the Water, Environmental Racism in Indigenous and Black Communities. Ingrid has also helped develop the Federal Private Members Bill, a national strategy respecting environmental racism and environmental justice, which was approved last Thursday to become Canada's first environmental justice law. This is a historic moment. Congratulations to everyone involved in this huge milestone for environmental justice and for the world. Switching to French. Angele Bernstein sera notre modératrice aujourd'hui. Angele est une journaliste bilingue de Montréal qui a couvert les changements climatiques et l'environnement pour des émissions en ligne et à la radio de CBC et des programmes d'information à la télé. Elle a plus de 10 ans d'expérience et a reçu nombreux prix, éloges et citations pour ses reportages. Once more, in English. Angele, Sébastien, Ingrid, and Angele, we look forward to the discussion. Over to you, Angele. Welcome our panelists.
Hi, everyone. Let everyone get seated and comfy here. Well, I am just thrilled to be here with this really impressive lineup of folks. We heard all of their accomplishments already from Sylvie, but I'm just so excited for the discussion we're going to have today. As a climate journalist especially, I'm extra pumped to be talking to them today. And of course, we're here to talk sustaining nature and the intersections of climate change, disability rights, environmental racism, and just transition. And I know this is going to be a really good discussion. All of them have a lot of really interesting things to say. We already got talking behind the curtain there. We couldn't stop ourselves. So I'm excited to hear all of you weigh in with some thoughtful insight on all of this. I'm going to stop talking now and hand over. The way things are going to work is we're going to have everyone do opening remarks, and then we'll launch into a bit of a Q&A discussion amongst ourselves. So without further ado, Ingrid, I think you'd like to be the first up to the podium.
So good morning, everyone. As was mentioned earlier, I'm a professor and the Hope Chair in Peace and Health in the Global Peace and Social Justice Program in the Faculty of Humanities at McMaster University. And before that, I was at Dalhousie in the Faculty of Health, where I began my work on environmental racism in 2012. I'm also the founder and executive director of the Enrich Project, the Environmental Noxiousness, Racial Inequities, and Community Health Project, the co-founder and co-director of the Canadian Coalition for Climate and Environmental Justice, and the past vice president of Rural Water Watch, a water testing NGO in Nova Scotia. Since 2012, I have been conducting research, engaging with policy interventions, and leading organizational initiatives to address environmental racism and climate change inequities in racialized and other vulnerable communities. And when I began the work, people often asked me what environmental racism was. They had never heard of the term, and got a lot of quizzical looks, particularly from journalists and community members. So there's a fantastic definition of environmental racism that comes from Dr. Robert Bullard, an African American who coined that term in the early 1990s. So environmental racism can be defined as racial discrimination in the disproportionate siting of toxic facilities in primarily Indigenous, Black, in the case of the United States, Hispanic, and other racialized communities. It's also about the lack of political power these communities have for fighting against environmental racism. So I always want to say that these communities have certainly, personal power. They do rise up. They are involved in movements, but because they're simultaneously low income, living in isolated areas, rural areas, because they're racialized, they're often not heard by government. So lack of political power, lack of social, economic power contributes to the difficulties that they've experienced challenging this issue. Environmental racism is also about policy. So when we see the spatial patterning of industry, primarily in these communities across Canada, it has everything to do with environmental policies and the policies and decision-making that is directed by policymakers who typically do not look like the communities that are impacted. So it's about the implementation of those policies and the implementation of environmental assessments that lead to the outcome that we see. Environmental racism is also in the disproportionate negative impacts of those environmental policies that result in the delays in cleanup. So that's when you have to ask, for example, in Pictou Landing First Nation in Nova Scotia, why did it take over 50 years for that community to have their issues addressed? In 1967, a mill started pumping effluent into Boat Harbor in Pictou Landing First Nation, and in 2020, the government announced that the mill would stop operating. So it's taken quite a long time for them to see redress. And finally, the other definition of environmental racism is in the history of excluding the very communities that have been impacted by environmental racism. So we often talk about certain communities not having a seat at the table. This is precisely what I'm talking about, is that we rarely see the impacted communities at the table, involved in decision-making, involved in policy-making. So those are the 5 definitions of environmental racism. So I just want to talk about just a few cases of communities that have been impacted by environmental racism across Canada over the last few years. So I want to start with Nova Scotia. First, Sébastien First Nation. Starting in 2014, they had to contend with a brine discharge pipeline being planned for their community. And fortunately, that project was halted in 2021. I just mentioned Pictou Landing First Nation. So starting in 1967, a mill started pumping wastewater into Boat Harbor in Pictou Landing First Nation. And as I mentioned, in 2019, the government announced that they needed to stop making broken promises to the community. They were making broken promises since the 1980s, promising the community that there would be cleanup, and it never happened. So they announced late in 2019 that they would close the mill. And in 2020, at the end of January, the mill was closed. Then we have Amjinwang First Nation, some of you might be familiar with, in Ontario, Sarnia, near Sarnia, Ontario. It's often referred to as Chemical Valley. And I mean, this is to me the worst case scenario of environmental racism. They have over 60 petrochemical facilities surrounding the Indigenous community in Amjinwang First Nation. You may have heard of Grassy Narrows First Nation. So in the 1960s and 1970s, mercury was dumped into the Wabigoon English River. And although there was cleanup in 2015, multi-million-dollar cleanup, the health effects remain. And people often talk about, well, there was cleanup. And I always say, yeah, but there are health effects that remain in the community. And in a 2022 CBC article, many residents came out to talk about some of those health impacts, including neurological issues, cognitive delays, numbness in fingers, etc. There's also Wet'suwet'en First Nation in northern BC. I think that gets a lot of attention these days. Wet'suwet'en First Nation, there's a multi-billion-dollar pipeline planned for that community. And over the past several years, there have been a lot of action amongst Canadians to stop or halt that project with sit-ins and marches, etc. One of the things I've noticed in doing this work is that people often don't associate environmental racism with Black communities. And during the time I spent in Nova Scotia, I found that in Nova Scotia particularly, there are a lot of cases of environmental racism in the African Nova Scotian community. Let's start with Africville. I would say that Africville, a very historical African Nova Scotian community, was subjected to both gentrification and environmental racism. And I think those two issues are intersecting issues. So the government was planning to push out the African Nova Scotian community from Africville to make way for industrial development. And in the wake of industrial development, a lot of social and environmental hazards were left in the community, including an open dump, 3 systems of railway tracks, a cotton factory, a tar factory, etc. We also have Lincolnville, another African Nova Scotian community. Starting in 1974, a first-generation landfill was placed in the community. And then in 2006, when I think the community felt that the first-generation landfill was going to be relocated, the government put a second-generation landfill on top of the first one. So like many of the communities I work with, they believe that high rates of cancer or increasing rates of cancer over the years is due to both landfills. And then we have Shelburne. Shelburne, the south of Shelburne is an African Nova Scotian community. The north of Shelburne is a white community primarily. In the south of Shelburne, where African Nova Scotians reside, there has been a dump in their community since 1943. I want to talk about the intersection of environmental racism and climate change because I feel that people often use those two terms interchangeably, climate change and environmental racism. They are different issues, but they are connected. So I want to just talk about that for a bit. So climate justice then is both a concept and a movement that recognizes that different communities will be impacted differently and unequally by climate change based on a number of factors. And these factors include race, socioeconomic status, social class, gender, age, disability, sexuality, geographic location, and other social identities and factors. The climate justice framework highlights the fact that Indigenous, Black, and other racialized and marginalized communities in the global North and South are disproportionately vulnerable to the climate crisis because they are more likely to be exposed to pollution and contamination from nearby industries. So when we talk about the pollution and contamination, that's environmental racism. So environmental racism and the pollution and contamination then gives rise to climate change, because when we talk about greenhouse gas emissions, for example, it's pollution that contributes to that. So that's a kind of how they're connected technically or chemically, I guess I would say. And it's also about where these communities live. They reside in places where they are more likely to be impacted by rising sea levels, disappearing shorelines, frequent and heavy rainfalls, raging storms and floods, intense heat waves, increasing wildfire, poor air quality, higher rates of climate-related diseases, and other effects of climate change. In addition, Indigenous, Black, and other racialized communities are at a greater risk for climate disasters because they are more likely to experience long-standing structural inequities. So in order to kind of understand why environmental racism happens and why climate change happens, we have to look at colonization. We have to look at the structural inequities that these communities are dealing with due to colonization, right? So those underlying structural inequities like low income and poverty and racism give rise to environmental racism and climate change. Environmental racism and climate change don't happen in isolation. They happen or they emerge out of existing structural inequities. So the link between climate inequities and environmental racism in Indigenous and Black communities specifically is clear when we consider the role that geography plays in both these crises. Indigenous communities, for example, on reserves, and in northern regions in Canada, and African Nova Scotian communities who are disproportionately located in rural and isolated places in Nova Scotia, a province that is mostly surrounded by sea. These are communities that are disproportionately impacted, as I said earlier, by climate disasters resulting from rising sea levels, etc. So we have to look at also where people live. Geography is a factor in this. With Black communities in Nova Scotia residing in those isolated semi-rural and rural places, Indigenous communities on reserves, that actually contributes to their exposure to climate change. When we trace the climate crisis back to slavery and colonialism, it becomes clear that climate change arose out of a legacy of extraction that disproportionately impacted Black and Indigenous people, and that consequently is inextricably linked to a legacy of environmental racism in these communities. Given these intersections, the fights against climate justice, climate change, environmental racism, and racial injustice are considerably intertwined and must be addressed together. So I just want to talk briefly about some of the things that my organization, the Enrich Project, has been doing to address both these issues. So since the fall of 2012, I've been engaged in multidisciplinary, multimedia, interdisciplinary, community-based work to address both of these issues. And these projects that I've been involved in include raising awareness. As I said earlier, a lot of people that I met just didn't understand the term environmental racism, and I realized I had to do a lot of work around raising awareness about environmental racism and also climate injustices in Canada. And I did that through workshops and symposiums and talks and conferences and other public events. I also conducted interdisciplinary community-based research led by the communities that have been impacted by these crises. I've shared research in multiple ways. This is part of the education and raising awareness that I needed to do, and I've used multimedia specifically because I understand that people want to receive information in very different ways. People learn in different ways, and I like to be creative, and for me, multimedia is a way to be creative. I've done mapping, mapping cases of environmental racism across Canada using a map that we use GIS analysis. I call it the Enrich map, and if you go onto my website, you'll see the location of Indigenous communities, Black communities, and the sites, waste sites that are near to those communities. I produced, as I meant, co-produced a documentary that was streamed on Netflix with Canadian actor Elliot Page. That's also on Prime Video and Microsoft Xbox. The Africville Story Map was created also for my project, so you can learn about Africville through maps, through audio, through video. It's kind of like a one-stop shop multimedia source for the story on Africville. And of course, I've given a lot of interviews to media and posted information on social media as well. There's also a book I wrote on environmental racism, and I found it also very important to build capacity in the communities. So not just take from the communities and never return, but to develop their skills. For example, develop their skills in water testing. I mentioned the Rural Water Watch, the organization I co-founded. We test water in these communities, but we also teach community members to test their own water. And finally, helping to develop the first environmental racism federal bill. As was mentioned earlier, that's been a journey since 2015, trying to get a provincial environmental justice bill passed. On Thursday of last week, the federal bill that I co-developed with Lenore Zan and that Elizabeth May introduced was finally passed at third reading. It becomes Canada's first environmental justice law. Along with that, there's going to be an environmental justice strategy, a national strategy where we're doing consultations across Canada with impacted communities, and I've been asked to consult on that environmental justice strategy. Also in Ottawa, an environmental racism symposium will be held in the fall at the library archives that I will be helping to organize. So there's a lot of things happening right now around environmental racism, and I'm really pleased to be at the center of it. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ingrid. That was fascinating, and I think it's not lost on us that we are on the cusp of a heat wave here in Montreal. I think it's already hitting Ontario, so we're definitely all thinking about, at least on my mind, I've been thinking about how people are affected differently in our cities or in rural areas by the heat. And we have the evacuations in the northwest of Canada for the wildfires, so definitely some food for thought there in what you were saying. And next, we have Angele, who's ready up at the podium, who's going to talk to us about just transition and some solutions as well. So I'll let you take it away, Angele.
Okay, thank you, Danse. My name is Angele Alook from Bixson Cree Nation in Treaty 8 Territory. I'm a gender studies professor and a labor expert, and I've been active in the UNFCCC, which I will discuss. So today I want to talk about Indigenous climate futures and restoring Indigenous economies of care and Indigenous climate leadership. So, my research asks these questions. How can we address the climate crisis using Indigenous knowledge systems, restoring Indigenous sovereignty, and uplifting the voices of Indigenous climate leaders? How can we transition our economy away from fossil fuels? How can we transition to the better future for all? What are Indigenous solutions to the climate crisis? And today I'll mostly be talking about Indigenous climate solutions and also using the voices and words of Indigenous folks that I've interviewed. And in order to answer this question, I'd like to redefine what a just transition is. And so a true just transition for Indigenous peoples should imagine a future built on Indigenous knowledges with transformational shifts in how we think about work and economies. A just transition should be for all, should be led by Indigenous understandings of economies and livelihood and life. So I'm just going to do a quick activity. I did this when I was in Dubai at the Canadian Pavilion. I want everyone to just close your eyes and imagine a time when you felt cared for, when someone served you food, when someone gave you a hug, when you felt like you belonged. And for me, that's going home to my community, that's eating moose meat, that's picking berries with my aunties, that's going to the garden with my children. It's speaking my language, which I love, and it's being on the land. And it's about the matriarchy, women leading our future. So imagine, open your eyes, imagine a world where we actually built our economies based on caring for each other, not on a death economy. So I'm going to read from my book, The End of This World. A capitalist colonial economy has caused Indigenous societies to go from economic systems of sharing, caring, respect, and reciprocity with the land, where responsibility to the collective provided well-being from cradle to grave, to now a colonial system that has displaced Indigenous peoples from their lands and pushed them into economies of poverty and dependency with only enough funding to keep them alive. Working to restore Mi'opamatsuwin, which means to live a good life in Cree, will destroy a capitalist colonial economy that is based on a death drive of Indigenous peoples and restore ethical Indigenous economies that are adapted to our present realities. So this time, when we think of this new future, the new economy must be built on life. The laws of Mi'opagamahawasuwin, which means raising your children in a good way, Mi'owichitawin, which means good relations and unity, Satuskatawin, meaning pulling together for survival, and one of the most important laws in my culture, Manachitawin, which means respect and reciprocity with the land. You should only take from the land what you need. And all of these lead to what I refer to as Mi'opamatsuwin in my research, which means to live a good life with balance between family and work. And together, these laws provide a strong basis for climate-safe, care-centered, and equitable world we want to build going forward. So I'd like us to just imagine a different future. And what helps me imagine this new future is doing research on this project that is called Indigenous Climate Leadership and Self-Determined Futures. So in this project, this project applies Indigenous research approaches to understand and support Indigenous climate leadership and governance through an Indigenous, feminist, and decolonial lens. So we spoke to Indigenous climate leaders at COP27, COP28. We also held intergenerational dialogues in Takaranto, Toronto, and we've spoken to Indigenous folks from all over Turtle Island, parts of Central and South America, and now recently we've interviewed Indigenous folks from parts of East Africa as well. Also, if you don't know what the UNFCCC is, it's the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, and COP is the convention of the parties of the UNFCCC. I'm just going to jump over this slide. So we did interviews at COP27, and we looked at what motivates Indigenous climate leaders, what challenges exist for them, what is Indigenous climate leadership, what is Indigenous self-determination, and what recommendations the community members make to value and support further Indigenous-led climate action. So, Indigenous people are motivated to be part of the international dialogues at the UNFCCC out of necessity. Despite this significant challenge of the colonial practice of COP, the conference undoubtedly matters because the settler world has ascribed its importance. So one way or another, decisions about all of our collective futures, as well as the futures of many other creatures, will be made in that space. So through community members, we heard that Indigenous leaders come to COP out of love for their people and ways of being, and Indigenous leaders must be included and elevated at COP in order to protect our lands and ways of life. This is a quote from Janine Yazzie. And she says, we're at a tipping point when it comes to climate change impacts. We're having to really think about and create greater safeguards for our rights as Indigenous peoples. In the COP space, Indigenous folks are fighting colonialism. So Indigenous peoples experience colonialism at the UNFCCC and at COP. So when considering these challenges, we heard that COP basically asserts colonialism through which nations are formally recognized and whose voices are valued, and that's who gets to make decisions. The colonial nature of this space creates a tension for Indigenous climate leaders who are fighting for not only climate solutions, but their sovereignty and rights to implement traditional sustainable knowledge and practice. And this is a quote from J.C. Chiblo from Indigenous Climate Action. She says, it's a fight every single day to make sure that Indigenous rights and human rights are at the top priority of everything. And there's actually a lot of states pushing back on that. Another thing that we've noticed is discussions about the importance of frontline action and things like food sovereignty. Here we have Sunshine Dustin Moore talking about the Mushroom Project in her community in Lytton, BC. And we've heard from other Indigenous folks talking about, things like controlled burns, alternative energy sources, activism through art and social media, and various other types of frontline action back home. But this is the next slide. I don't know why I'm not. Okay. So an important thing that we also noticed that's part of Indigenous climate leadership is centering women and two-center folks. Community members shared stories of women and two-spirit leadership when it came to discussing Indigenous climate leadership. Traditional Indigenous knowledges promote equal respect and inclusion of the spectrum of genders, work, and community. Colonialism has eroded Indigenous ways of being over time, resulting in widespread systems of patriarchy. Community members share that true Indigenous climate leadership requires intentional elevation of women's and two-spirit climate action. And here we hear from Dane D'Souza from the Métis National Council, and he says that we have learned from our First Nations ancestors the concept of being two-spirited, that concept of celebrating those within your community who are different, which enables them to navigate different spaces and conversations. And we also heard from Kennedy Tuckaroo, who talked about the power of female leadership in these spaces. And a lot of these climate leaders are women. I think I'm over my time, but I just wanted to also talk about centering climate justice as a recommendation from these discussions we had at COP27. Colonialism causes climate change, and that colonialism is still alive and well, and the machine is still working against us, even after first contact, hundreds of years after first contact. We're still fighting for our very lives and existence. It's just now, it's in our water that we're having to protect. It's in our food systems that we're trying to protect. It's in our lands and, trying to make sure that we're protecting our animals in the air and the water. That's Jacob Crane from Tsuut'ina First Nation. I'm just going to close off now. When I interview people in my home community and within these COP spaces, I often end the interview by asking people, what are your hopes for the future? And I get two common responses. Indigenous folks hope for Indigenous sovereignty. They hope for their future generations. This is a quote from my cousin, who is an environmental officer in my home community. And when I asked her this question, she said, I feel that we're connected to the land as First Nations peoples. We were protectors. We were given the duty to protect the land as First Nations peoples. I want my child to be able to see all the trees and have fresh water, not contaminated water. I'm sorry. And I like my child to protect more treaty rights, to do hunting and trapping and gathering and medicines and berries, and just having a respect for the land and living off the land. I'm sorry, but this means a lot to me. This is my community and this is our land. So thank you.
Thank you for sharing that. And I know that's a really vulnerable thing to share testimony on. So thank you for sharing something so personal for you with the rest of us and being vulnerable in that. I really appreciate it. And I want to just highlight something you said that really stood out to me. The responsibility to the collective provided well-being from cradle to grave. I think coming out of this, that's something I'm going to think about in my climate journalism. And I think that's a really poignant point that you made. So thank you. Sébastien.
Okay, well, thank you. I want to start by thanking my union for allowing me to participate in this event. We've been on strike since April 24th, and because of the subject matter of this panel aligns with the equity objectives of the Union of McGill Law Professors, they allowed me to participate. So I'm grateful to them for that. So let me, I'm going to make 4 points about the intersections of disability and climate change. But before I begin, I want to share something with you, which is that I guess in my first year of my tenure track position here, I was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis. And that is the experience that led me to begin working on the intersections of climate change and disability. So specifically, I discovered that in the summer, I was very sensitive to heat. In fact, before they had MRI machines, they would diagnose people with MS by putting them in hot baths. So that was one thing that I realized. And then also in the early years of my journey, I guess, with MS, I had some mobility challenges. And so I suddenly found myself having to drive to work, having to use the disability parking at McGill. And suddenly, was thinking, oh, maybe the people who drive are not just all evil people who don't think about climate change or the environment. Maybe they have health reasons or other structural reasons that make it impossible or unlikely for them to use other modes of transportation. And so that epiphany, if you will, led me to also think about the importance of accessibility and even empathy in how we approach both efforts to ensure that we're resilient to climate change, but also that efforts transition to a low carbon world are also accessible. I like to point this out also because if you've never thought of the connections between disability and climate change, I don't want you to feel bad about it. I had never thought of it either, and I was a climate expert until I was diagnosed with MS. If you work for a government and you've never thought of the connection between disability and climate change, I would like you to feel bad about that, because actually there are laws that oblige you to take that into account, and Canada has signed treaties to that effect. And there's now more and more research that myself and other colleagues have been able to put out in the world. So I'm hoping that you will reconsider and think about how to do better. Okay, so the 4 things I want to say. First, people with disabilities are disproportionately affected by climate change. So I'll just give you one data point about this. In the Pacific heat dome that struck the Northwest in June and July 2021, so over 600 people died in BC, 92% had a disability. So if your analysis of what happened during the heat dome focused on other factors than disability, then you're missing a huge part of the puzzle. The second point I want to make about the disproportionate impacts of climate change on people with disabilities is that they're not natural, they're not sort of just something that's happening, they're the result of decisions that have placed people into positions of vulnerability. So to illustrate this, I'll refer to a heat wave that struck Montreal in July 2018. 60 people died during this heat wave. A quarter of the people who died had schizophrenia. that's a death rate that's 500 times their share of the Quebec population. So you might wonder, why would people with schizophrenia be more likely to die in a heat wave? And when you look at answering that question, you can see how different factors play a role in generating vulnerability. So first, in terms of exposure, the people who died lived in neighborhoods that were sort of more socioeconomically disadvantaged. There were fewer green spaces. They lived in buildings that didn't have air conditioning or passive cooling. So they're just more exposed to the impacts of a heat wave. In terms of sensitivity, if you do have schizophrenia, you may elect to take certain medications that actually make you very intolerant to heat, so there is that individual susceptibility. But the main reason that we can point out and explain this disproportionate death rate is what's called adaptive capacity. So what assets, what services, what knowledge, what support do people have access to that allows them to cope with and be resilient and adapt to a changing climate? So the first thing that you should know is that the different authorities responding to this heat wave did not have this community in mind. If you looked at the heat wave response plans pre this heat wave, what they referenced were older people and children. So they didn't have this community in mind. There was nothing in the adaptation planning of the City of Montreal then or today that actually looks at how disability might make you more sensitive, might expose you to greater climate risks. So ultimately, and then in the longer term barriers, right? So if people, and it's not everyone who lives with schizophrenia that dies in a heat wave, but you're more likely to. Why? Because your condition is stigmatized, you don't necessarily have friends and family checking in on you, and you don't necessarily have the income to live in a air conditioning building or in a neighborhood that has green spaces. So ultimately, what we need to look at are both the sort of short-term, medium-term, and long-term barriers to climate adaptation in terms of ensuring resilience of people with disabilities. The third point that I want to make is that people with disabilities are also affected adversely by measures that are designed to reduce carbon emissions. So this is one of the first empirical studies that we've done here in Montreal. So we've interviewed around 25 people with disabilities, with diversity of lived experience of disabilities and impairments, about how they're affected by the really significant and changes that the city is making to transportation. So Montreal has a very ambitious plan to decarbonize transportation. It is the largest source of carbon emissions in the city. And so by interviewing this diverse sort of community, we were able to see what kind of barriers are being addressed, or unfortunately what we really found is that mostly what these interventions are doing is they're reinforcing barriers to mobility. So I'll share just one example of that. We have all these bike lanes in Montreal that have been developed, which I love. I'm a cyclist. I love these bike lanes. But unfortunately, they've been designed in a way that makes it inaccessible for a wheelchair user who uses a vehicle to access the sidewalk. It doesn't have to be this way. San Francisco has actually an accessible design, but we don't have that in Montreal. And so we interviewed someone who told us they had to leave school because they couldn't literally get into their building where they were studying because of these bike lanes. So that's just an illustration of at a micro level of how these interventions can actually reinforce barriers. More broadly, the issue with our whole thinking about how to reduce carbon emissions is that we're thinking that all we have to do is tinker with incentives and information and people will change their behaviors. But we're failing to take into account our differences in why someone might be more dependent on a certain form of transportation than another, and also how available are the alternatives to, say, motorized transportation. And so in the city of Montreal, for instance, you should know that the vast majority of our subway system is inaccessible to people with mobility impairments. So if the whole idea is, it's harder or more expensive to drive a car, people will take the metro, only makes sense if the metro is accessible. Okay, the final point that I want to make is that what our research has shown is that people with disabilities are systematically being neglected in climate adaptation and mitigation policies. But actually, There's so much potential to including people with disabilities in climate action. It would not only ensure that those actions are accessible to and inclusive of people with disabilities, they really do actually end up increasing the wider share of people who can benefit from and contribute to a transition to a low carbon and more climate resilient world. And I have lots of examples if we can have some time during the discussion period. So thank you very much.
Thank you for that. Thank you, Sébastien. And I have to say, as I'm listening to the three of you speak, I mean, you all have your very distinct areas of study and knowledge, and yet really what all of you are talking about today is people who are disproportionately affected by, be it climate change or environmental issues or climate action and climate mitigation. And I think that's where all of you have said similar things and yet in very different ways. So I'm excited to continue the conversation. Just wanted to ask, how are we doing on time for the discussion portion? Okay. I'm going to try and do then I'm going to throw some questions at each of you then, and then we'll see if we have any time left over after that. I'm going to start with you, Ingrid, because I don't know if everyone heard, but just to emphasize it again, you co-developed a bill that has passed the third reading vote at the Senate. All it needs left is royal assent, basically. I don't know if anyone here has ever developed a bill before, but it's a pretty big deal. So I think that deserves an acknowledgement again. Canada's first environmental justice strategy. And I know you've been working on this and many things for over a decade now in this line of work, and I have a feeling it hasn't always been easy. So I'd love it if you share some examples of bumps in the road, hurdles and challenges you've overcome in your work, and maybe give people some advice on how you were able to overcome those challenges. If you can do that succinctly.
Sure. This is not a topic that I chased. It's very ironic that this has become my work because my doctoral and postdoctoral work looked at Black women's experiences with mental illness and help seeking. And I thought I would continue doing that. And then in 2012, an environmental activist came to my office and he said, I want you to do a project on environmental racism. He was leaving to go to Oakland, California to do a startup. And at that time, a lot of Nova Scotians were leaving. There were no jobs. And I said, environmental racism, what's that? I've never heard of it. I was very hesitant to take it on because I have no degrees in the environment. I've never worked in that area. It scared me, but I realized quickly that it was a health issue and that I was also excited to work with Black, African, Nova Scotian and Indigenous communities. So I said yes, very hesitantly. The first challenge was just people not believing in what I was doing, being skeptical about the term and about the reality of environmental racism. Journalists who would look at me and say, are you sure? Is this a real thing? And community members who would email me. I never got any disrespectful emails. I have colleagues who have gotten some emails that I have never in my career, thankfully, gotten disrespectful emails, but people just saying, environmental racism, really?
People not believing you?
Not believing the reality of this. People saying to me, are you sure it's about race? It seems to be more about class. Somebody sent me an email saying that. I said, well, why can't it be about race and class? There's an intersectional framework. We have to, Sébastien just talked, we have to look at the intersections of race and gender and disability and sexual orientation. That's the framework I use. So I said, can it not be about both? Because the communities that are racialized that I was dealing with were also, yes, low income, but also geographically isolated. There are all these intersections. That was the first challenge. The other challenge was I was teaching in the health professions. I'm not a health professional, but it seems like my career as a sociologist, I'm a health sociologist, has been teaching in disciplines that are not my own. And getting my students in nursing and in occupational therapy to validate this and to see environmental determinants of health and other social determinants of health as something they should care about was really tough, to the point where I had antagonistic students in my classroom, and I started to say to myself, Ingrid, is this profession of being a professor for you? I started to question whether or not I should be doing this because they didn't want to know. They didn't want to know about environmental issues. And I understand that for a nurse, getting the technical skills is most important, of course. I mean, if you go to a nurse, you want to know they can put a needle in. you don't really care if they know about environmental racism. I get that. But I also think it's important that they understand environmental determinants of health and other structural determinants of health as nurses who will be dealing with a variety of people who are diverse. So I would say the challenges, the teaching was really difficult in terms of students questioning why I was hired, why am I teaching them sociology, why do they need to know about environmental issues? And it's crucial with crises, environmental crises. You want a nurse there, right? So, there have been challenges, times when I never doubted myself, but wondered whether or not I was in the right profession, whether or not I was wasting my time. But I just kept going because the topic just intrigued me. It felt like a puzzle that I needed to solve. It still does. I feel like there's something that's missing that I need to solve. And until I solve it, I'm not going to stop.
Well, clearly you've persevered. So good for you. And I mean, I think the proof is in the pudding. We've seen that you've persevered and didn't give up. So congratulations to you for that. Wow. I think that blends nicely into Angele, because your work is similar in some ways and yet different. And I was refreshing my mind on your book over the weekend, preparing for this, and there's a moment in your book where you talk about the wildfires in Fort McMurray, and you're talking about families having to flee and evacuate in the crisis, and people from all sorts of different walks of life pitching in as a community and come together. And you write, when a fire or flood comes, it does not matter whether or not you're on a reserve, in the city, or on a farm. And I thought, what an interesting kind of metaphor to talk about the different, silos in our society that people are in. And I'd love for you to expand on that for people here, to talk about maybe some of the ways in our society that we are in those silos and perhaps shouldn't be, and how you'd build on that for how you see kind of the ideal Canada or the ideal version of your community moving forward.
So I guess I'll go back to the forest fires in northern Alberta. So coming from northern Alberta and having lived in Alberta during some of these forest fires, I started to notice how, one summer there was a Slave Lake fire, then the Fort McMurray fire, and then there was a fire in my community at Big Stone, and then after that there was fires in Métis settlements that actually burned down a couple communities, and it felt like we kept taking turns taking care of each other. And so one summer, the town of Slave Lake would take care of my community. The next summer, my community would take care of that community. And then when the Fort McMurray fire happened, everybody took care of everybody. But I do want to say that Indigenous peoples are disproportionately impacted by forest fires. And because of how we fall between federal and provincial jurisdiction, there are some gaps when there is an emergency like this. But there is a sense of community. So I can really criticize the federal government and the provincial government and in how they respond to these fires.
And when you say gaps, sorry to interrupt, but when you say gaps, you mean maybe not getting an evacuation notice in time, right?
Yeah, but also that, for example, in one of the forest fires, we had a busload of elders, and many of them with disabilities, that were evacuated without their medications, without the people evacuating knowing what illnesses or multiple illnesses that they had. And then, the social worker in my community, who's my mom, having to figure out, how to serve our elders with disabilities when they were evacuated. And so, we kind of I think that's the problem with the Indian Act and our colonial government, is that we often, especially with health disparities, fall in between the cracks. But during the forest fire that happened in my community in 2019, there was a moment where we were worried that the fire was going to come near my parents' house. And then we got a phone call from SCARS, which is an organization that takes care of animals and rescues animals, and they had to go in and rescue our dogs and our horses. And the way I grew up in my community, it's like 5 reserve plots around the 2 lakes, and then a hamlet where the settlers and Métis folks live. And so in that moment, like we all came together, and it just made me realize realize again how the Indian Act has divided us between First Nations and Métis people, and then even the settlers that we've lived with for years that we have community with. So the forest fires really made me realize like the care that I get in my community from everybody there. But still, there were class differences, race differences, and disability differences in how we were evacuated. Yeah. And in our book, we talk about this idea of solidarity, Seduskadawan, pulling together in times of crisis. And part of that law, that principle, is that you take care of the most vulnerable when you do pull together in times of crisis.
I get a sense from what you're saying that there were moments like that where everyone pulled together, regardless of their stripes. But maybe you'd like to see more of that all the time, not just in those moments.
Yeah. And I just also want to add, like, having been active in the UNFCCC, where Indigenous folks from all over Canada and all over the world come together in solidarity to fight for Indigenous rights at the UN level. We also have great solidarity with certain civil society organizations that support us. For example, when we were in Dubai, there was an action that was organized by a First Nation, but also brought together people from like Indigenous Climate Action, Environmental Network, Environmental Defense, CanRec. So we all came together, and we raised awareness about the environmental destruction of the tar sands industry. It was a protest against tar sands, but also we just, I don't know, we came together in that moment.
Yeah.
And raised awareness that polluters need to pay for the damage that they're doing to the environment, and specifically fossil fuel industry in my traditional territory. So that was another example of solidarity that just made me feel like we're coming together to do something, and made me hopeful to be in that action. Yeah.
Thank you for sharing that. I'm going to turn to Sébastien now. I know you said you'd like to share more examples, and I mean, your area of research really is under-researched. And so I think I'm learning a lot just listening to you talk about these examples that we have here in Montreal of how not just climate change itself is affecting people with disabilities differently, but the actions we're taking to try and mitigate climate change is having a negative impact. I'd love for you to just share more examples in your work that I think we could all benefit from learning. And if you have time to maybe touch on whether or not you've seen any progress in recent years in governments or society at large doing any better.
Well, I'll take the progress question first. The first time I discussed disability and climate change at the climate negotiations was in 2019. And I remember, and I've been going to climate negotiations for a long time and meeting with people, and I'm like, I'm working on disability and climate change. And they're like, I don't know what you mean. So I get fewer, I don't know what you means reactions, but I think we are very much still at the stage of even sort of consolidating and creating this as a field of research. In terms of progress, so we have now, for the last 2 years, released an international report where we assess all of the climate policies in the world. We look at whether they mention disability. So we've seen an increase for sure, and now we have a third of the adaptation policies of the world that mention disability in some way. But that still means that 2/3 of countries in the world don't mention disability in any way in their adaptation policies, even though the Paris Agreement recognizes that people with disabilities are more affected by climate change alongside other equity-seeking groups. So there's a lot of work to be done. So we're still at the stage really of trying to raise awareness and bring to the forefront the voices of people with disabilities from all over the world. And so we do a lot of events. Actually, the last time I went to climate negotiations was 2019, because I really don't want to be the person who's always talking about this issue. So we have a great network of people that we work with from around the world who are in the frontline communities in the global south. We have a podcast that I'm going to plug called Enabling Commons, where we've interviewed people with disabilities from all over the world about their lived experience of climate change and climate action. And I guess what I will say in terms of, two things. A very concrete policy that I'm very excited about is in the United States. It's in the 2021 infrastructure bill, thanks to the efforts of Senator Tammany Duckworth, who's a wheelchair user. There's money in that bill that's earmarked. So the law itself is all about pushing green infrastructure in the United States. But there's money in that law that takes the existing transit and railway stations that are inaccessible and to make them accessible. And so if we can find more, if we can use climate action, which is going to require a lot of transformative changes to how we do things to be resilient and also to decarbonize our economies, if we can use that as an opportunity to make our society more accessible and inclusive of people with disabilities, I think that's something that I hope we can do. And the second thing is, we know that in the disability community we have a lot of knowledge, and I always like to say this: the thing that we know really well is how to make things work for as many people as possible. And so that knowledge and that lived experience can be really useful when you're thinking about, okay, how are we going to ensure that people are safe during X event, or how are we going to ensure that all these people who right now maybe are driving, how do we think about what barriers they're facing, and how do we ensure that the solutions to maybe allowing them to do things differently, how do we make sure those are accessible? This is really a lot of the expertise that we have in the disability community around universal design is really valuable. And so ultimately, by designing things in a way that works for people in relation to all their different types of abilities, you're just in general increasing the share of the population that can participate in this effort, including the growing share of older adults. So in Canada, half of the adults over 70 have a disability. So if you're not thinking about how your transition to decarbonization is going to be accessible to people with disabilities, it means you're leaving out, by the way, 20% of the Canadian population. So it's 1 out of 5 Canadians has a disability. You're leaving out 50% of people who are over 70. So it's a huge problem, and also in terms of intersectionality, unfortunately, because of colonization, because of systemic racism, disability is overrepresented in First Nations communities. It's overrepresented amongst Black communities in cities, and so if clearly we all need to work together, intersectionality, as Ingrid mentioned, to tackle all of the intersecting and compounding ways in which different structural forces place people at risk in the climate crisis.
Thank you. Do we have time for one more question for everyone? No, we don't. You call a series Big Thinking, and yet we have to squeeze Big Thinking into short little snippets, don't we? We've been given a challenge here. Well, thank you, all of you. I think we could have filled maybe about 3 hours with this, but this will have to do. Thank you for sharing your stories and your research as well. And I think we're all going to walk away with having learned something here today. So I'm going to throw over to Barrington Walker, who's going to wrap up for us. Thank you, Barrington.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much to our panelists, Ingrid Waldron, Sébastien Jodoin, and Angele Alook, and our moderator, Jayla Bernstein, for that thought-provoking conversation. On behalf of the Federation for the Humanities and Social Sciences and McGill University, thank you to the Big Thinking series leading sponsors, the Canada Foundation for Innovation, and Universities Canada, and this event's presenting partner, the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council. If you would like to revisit the conversation, the video will be available on the Congress virtual platform in the coming days, where you can view it until July 31st, 2024. The next Big Thinking panel, Sustaining Political Community, with Omera Issa and Colette Bryn, will take place Wednesday, June 19th from 12:15 to 1:15 p.m. As Congress continues, you can participate in the conversation on social media using the hashtag Congress, so Congress with an H at the end. I also invite you to fill out a short survey on your experience at today's Big Thinking lecture. Use your mobile device, and you can scan the QR code on the screen behind me or on the sides posted at the door to share your feedback. Merci, and thank you all for joining us today. Please enjoy the rest of your day and your remaining sessions at Congress.